Okay, so let's talk about those initial passwords because that's really this is what about. I mean, we've talked about default passwords and we talk about initial passwords, and there's a subtle difference in some sense because the initial password is the one that comes with the device. The default password is the default password that you get when you reset the device. So they're usually the same thing, but in some ways they're conceptually different. So there's my slide. Let them use a password manager. Um, so um, this is what will happen after you do a reset. And usually you force the user to generate a new password. So one of the major things is please let them paste the password. I had a bank that insisted that this was, they went way out of their way with extensive amounts of JavaScript to keep me from pasting in my well randomly chosen password, um, so that I would have to type it in. And the end result, of course, is the password went on a sticky note on the wall, which was completely wrong direction. And they just couldn't understand what the issue was. And it's so nice to have advice now that says, please do this. So you choose a new password. There's a strength meter here, but the critical one is almost all browsers. This is an example from Chrome, but I know Firefox does it, Safari, Opera, and then there's 5 or 6 plugins that uh, are of, I have no idea, but they're all out there. Some of them infest my Twitter feed with advertising. Um, and use suggested password is the idea here. The generated one is better than anything else. So if you're coming up, the best idea is the best default password, and sometimes is the no password. So that means that the user, the first time they face the device, they won't have anything. They won't have to know anything, and the device will force them to pick a new password. So the key thing, though, it you really have to be able to get to physically touch the device, and only someone with physical possession of the device can set this initial password. How does that work? Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, but it could be that your refrigerator won't go online until you walk up to the refrigerator and type the password in on the LCD. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that it's not going in your password manager. It's probably weak. So you have to think about there's a bunch of user interaction things that are really beyond this talk or my expertise to talk about. But realize that if you're demanding a password on the device and you have a crappy keyboard, you're going to get a crappy password. So, for example, some devices that have a cloud integration and they've already online will send you a password by SMS every time you use it. There's a few conferencing systems where I mysteriously don't have a password for that. Every now and then, when my browser cookie expires, they send me a new password by email or a new link by email. I click on it and everything's good for 30 days. Obviously, you can't do that with some kind of a home appliance. It's not on the internet yet, so it can't do anything. But once it is on the internet, well, that may be the right way to do it. So this is an example from a newly installed Drupal content management system. That's not obviously an IoT device, but I still thought it was a very good model that they took, which is that they basically didn't come with any default. And the system won't operate, by the way. It simply doesn't operate at all, unless you set this password up. You can't deploy your website. You can't do anything that way. So the user's going to be forced to choose it. So why even have one? So this comes down to a bit of an argument in the community. What if they never use the smart aspects of the device? Is that going to be a problem? Well, it might be. So one of the attack scenarios that was discussed a decade ago is what happens if somebody, for instance, were to walk through the Home Depot and they were to say, take control of all the light bulbs, all the smart light bulbs that are at that Home Depot. Take them out of the box, whatever, do something, put them back in the box, and allow them to be purchased and taken home. There's a hypothesis about a decade ago that smart light bulbs would become so cheap that they wouldn't be worth, and LED light bulbs would become so ubiquitous that no one would bother making stupid light bulbs or dumb light bulbs. So they'd all be smart. So everyone would bring them home, plug them in, and they would operate as follows. When you plug them in and applied power, they would go on. And when you took away power, they go off. So they look like a light bulb. They operate like a light bulb, and people don't even know that they're smart. So later on, the attacker comes along, and now a couple months later, and now controls several 100,000, maybe a million light bulbs on, throughout the East Coast of the United States, let's say. And they decide to turn them on, and then they decide to turn them off, and they leave them on just long enough so that all the gas-fired plants start producing electricity to power them, and then they turn them off just in time for the gas-powered plants to be on. And this attack, essentially, if you do it about 3 times in a row in 10 minutes, what happens is the gas-fired plants break. And we're back to August 2003, and we have a countrywide blackout. So that's a real concern, and this was described in a couple papers a decade ago as to one of the risks of this. And so that's one of the concerns. What if the device, essentially, the home user never knows they're smart, and so in fact there's no initial password? So I mean, there's a bunch of things where you say, well, some examples. I can use my refrigerator, keeps my food cold. My clothes washer cleans things. My dryer dries things. My stove turns on when I push the buttons. Even my TV, I change the channels. I don't necessarily have to use the smart function. You could even have someone who installed smart locks, but they don't actually ever do them. They just essentially put the key in because there's an override key, and they always use that. So my washing machine, which I tried to buy without a Wi-Fi option, but it came with one anyway. Apparently, I didn't pay for the extra feature, but apparently they just don't offer it without. And in order for me to do it, I have to enable it. I have to walk up to the device. I have to hold this delay wash button down for a while, and then this Wi-Fi light turns on. So in this case, my washer is not enabled for the smart aspect until I actually do this. And now with this race condition, now I have to make sure I use the app that came with it. I have to onboard it to the app. I have to set up a relationship, as I showed in one of the earlier slides. There was no password to enter. It did onboarding with a special access point ID, and that was it. Okay, well, great. So we get into this problem. Well, I could operate my washing machine now remotely, but it's okay because now it's secure. It can only be operated by me. So the concern is that if the device is essentially going to be available on the network, then maybe it needs to be completely disabled. An example of a device that's useless without internet would be a smart speaker. It can't do anything without the internet. So you must onboard it, and it can't be sitting in a way where anyone can take over it while it's just sitting there. Because an example is, for instance, someone buys one, can't figure out how to make it work, and it just sits there turned on until someone takes it over. So that means that some of those devices, a strong initial password is probably still needed, or some kind of a mechanism to make sure that it's onboarded properly is still important. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little about storing. We're going to get into some of the technical parts of the passwords and how we deal with them and how we work with them. There was a article which I came by yesterday afternoon. I wasn't able to put it in my slides, but I'll try and share it at the end of the meeting, about some industrial devices. And one of the things about this is that they apparently had all the passwords. They had passwords used to log into their cloud aspect, and those passwords got out. And so attackers were now essentially doing something to the cloud aspect because they had stored passwords more or less unencrypted in the device. So the question is, how do you store a password in the device? So the obvious thing is to say, well, I better encrypt it, right? So I'm going to encrypt it with some key. So there's the password. It was password, and encrypted to this gobbledygook, and it was encrypted with some key. But, well, how do I use it? Well, I have to decrypt it. So that means I have to keep the key around. Well, actually, I don't have one password now. I have 2 passwords. I have the password that the user uses and the password that I use to encrypt it. And you think, oh, well, it's buried in my source code and no one will find it. And that's just false. You should always assume that someone has a copy of your source code, because I assure you that the black hats do. And they'll get that key. In the case of the Philips Hue light bulb, this is what they did. It was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. The software update key was kept this way as a symmetric key. And someone basically just decompiled the update, got the key, and took over the hundreds of lights. There's a bit of a debacle. The other thing is that this is kind of a bit unsafe for configuration backups, because if you can decrypt the password in the backup because there's a constant key, then essentially anyone can get the configuration backup, can figure out what the password was. So don't do this. It's not necessary. Instead, you do what we've done on essential Unix machines for 50 years now, is you take the password, you use it as the key, and you encrypt it. And when the user comes along and types it in again, you encrypt it again and see if you get the same result. It's a deterministic one-way hash function. So back in 1975, we used OneDes for this thing, and today in 2020, you use SHA-256, and it just works. It's safe for backups. You can't extract it any easier from the backup. It assumes that someone can see it. I'll just say it doesn't work with Kerberos or Active Directory. If you're building IoT devices that have to work with that, then you probably have other considerations to begin with. So recovering lost passwords. So there's some good password reset advice about websites and other things like this. One of the critical things about this is that just because they ask for a password reset doesn't mean that they actually wanted one. And so you actually have to have a two-phase commit process. If your device is connected to the cloud, then, because that's where you provide your services, then you probably already are authenticating them to the cloud. You have their email. Yeah, use that. It's a standard web kind of password reset. If your device only somehow talks to social media, then I would say use that, because it's probably better than anything else you can do. It's not a great choice, but I think it's a better choice than some other things. Does it have a screen or buttons? Then you should use that, okay? The device physically secure, like my washing machine. If I lose pairing, I assume I go back and I push that button and I hold it down and it resets. That sounds pretty good, because if I ever sell it to somebody else, they can recover the password by just doing that. And the odds of someone having physical access to my washing machine is relatively low. I suppose someone could wander around my house and while I'm having a party or something and reset it, and that's a concern. And that's actually becomes a really big concern if your device is in some kind of a shared environment. A lot of devices are not really designed for that. So for instance, a fitness monitor that you might use at a school or a gym would be a big deal. I know that when my child was in elementary school, they had a whole set of step counters, and this was to help them understand how much activity that they do. And each classroom would sign them out for like a month, and they would wear them around with them to find out how many steps they took. And I guess they interfaced. Well, I think the ones they used had a number on the front of them. They weren't smart at all, but the ones we have today are. And so you have to think: is this device going to be passed from person to person, and it needs to get essentially reset every time it's used, or is this a device that I'm going to give to somebody and I should worry about whether or not they're going to abuse it while they have it in their possession? An example of such a device like that is if you've ever gone to a restaurant where they have a reservation list and they give you a little hockey puck or disc or something, and you go and wander off into the bar or the park or go for a walk or something, and when your table's ready, it buzzes, right? So there's some kind of radio device that communicates with it. So could I take these and could I repair them to another restaurant, or what can I do? Could I make other people's things buzz, more often? I don't know what I could do, but the point is that clearly I have physical possession of the device, and that maybe that's not enough to reset the device. On the other hand, if you tell the user to hold down 4 different keys and that'll reset the device, that may be relatively difficult to do. And you think, okay, that's not going to happen by accident. Well, I can tell you with my mother, it's not going to happen by intention either. She's never going to manage to reset that device. It's always going to be too hard for her. And the device, worst case, is going to sit there, not actually really ever used, and someone else will come along and maybe take it over. So you have to think about both making it hard enough to do so that it doesn't happen by mistake, but easy enough so that a reasonable category of people who aren't 16 can do it. So usually the reset process involves doing a factory reset. Usually that means you're sending the device back to initial conditions. So that means back to that initial password. So now you better make sure they change it again, right? And you also have to make sure it's going to go through an onboarding process. Okay. Well, one of the questions is what happened to all their settings, like their Wi-Fi settings, which was mentioned, or the relationship with other devices that they need to authenticate. Is that information still around? Is it present in a way that can be exploited? So for instance, if I factory reset the device, can I get credentials out of the device at that point, or do they just stay in it? So most enterprise routing equipment, for instance, what they do is when you factory reset the device, what they run is they start up an auxiliary configuration that lets you come in and reset the device. Usually none of the configuration is there at all, except that you can find your old configuration as usually something called old configuration or saved configuration. So you change the password, you reload your old configuration and you save it again, and then you restart the device. That's a really good model to follow. Okay. But important part here, you got to make sure that your configuration is either tamper proof or if it can be viewed by random people, that it doesn't reveal something. Okay. So in the case of routing equipment, there may be some other relationships that you need to encode in there. So one of the things that's happened over and over again is people have tried to brute force attack on passwords. And so there's two kinds of brute force attacks that you have to concern yourself about. There are online attacks, and that's where you log on to the device, you try some things, and you wait for it to say yes or no. This is what the FBI wanted to do with Apple phones. And of course, the problem is that after a certain number of attempts, they say, no, I won't do that. I'm not going to allow any more entries. Important part about this is the device gets to decide how fast it's going to do the work. So if the password checks out, well, you can be connected and online and to the device as quickly as the password is good. But if the password is wrong in any way, then you can be as slow as you like. You could take 5 seconds before you let them try again. Annoying, frustrating if they just, flub the keys or something like that. But the idea is that it doesn't matter how they got it wrong. It takes the same amount of time. And that's actually pretty important because there are attacks where they basically say, well, I'm going to try something. And if it fails after I type the first character, then I know it's wrong. So I'll try a different first character. And in movies, when you see people hook up, pin decoders or something to door locks, and you see each character show up one at a time, they're essentially exploiting that flaw in the process. Whether there's real door locks that actually can be attacked like that, I feel doubtful, but it certainly makes a good movie plot. And this is really in a very deep way. This people thought, well, this only applies to user interfaces. Well, it turns out that in some cases it applies deeply into memory and I/O systems as well. And that's a deeper thing because they're mostly talking about consumer IoT devices, not multi-tenant virtualization systems where that's an issue. So offline attacks are ones where the attacker gets to use their own equipment. So this is the case where you've stolen an encrypted password file or something like this. And now you're going to try to decrypt the passwords to see what's in there. So the attacker gets to apply as much effort as they like. They can buy as much cloud resources and compute power as they like. Odds are that they're probably just going to steal them. If they've already attacked a few other people and they already have a few credit cards, then the purpose of decrypting this file is to get more credit cards. And so they're just going to buy the resources. So the best defense is just don't have a secret. There's nothing there for them to get, right? So for instance, this would mean on your device that if there is a credential that's in your device, that it's stored in a place that can't be exfiltrated into a TPM device. So password file, if you're gone that way with a SHA-256, well, it's pretty immune to quite a number of attacks at this point, but you do have to concern about this stuff. And again, assume the attacker has a copy of source code and that your algorithm is not secret. So they know exactly what to attack. And by the way, back in the 1990s, the EFF built a cracker, a hardware attack brute force machine that broke one DES. And that's why we don't use it anymore. It's because essentially they showed that not only could well-funded governments do it, but from somewhat well-funded NGOs could do it as well.